Friday, March 18th, 2011. Numerous protesters gathered at the Mari Mosque in Syria quickly discovered themselves engaged in a bloodbath with the Syrian army, following one of the worst regimes and rulers in all of the Middle East, creating a domestic situation courtesy of the Assad regime, desperately trying to silence the protesters of Syria. But what the president quickly learned, they were a force to be reckoned with. They were a ravenous population, destined to make Syria a refined society, and through the weaponization of the protest, they had their army prepared to fight a war against the beast of Syria. In 2011, the Syrian conflict began following the Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. Syria, under the rule of Bashar al-Assad, the president, had been ruled by the same family for over 4 decades, and the population was growing increasingly discontent with the authoritarian regime. In March of 2011, protests against the government began to spread across the country, calling for political reforms and an end to the government's oppressive policies. The Syrian government responded to the protests with violence, using military and security forces to crack down on demonstrators. This only served to escalate the situation. Opposition groups began to form to challenge the government. The main opposition group, being the Syrian Opposition Council, was composed of a coalition of political parties and other groups, including the Free Syrian Army and a group of defectors from the Syrian military. The Syrian conflict has not only involved the Syrian government and opposition groups within the country, but it's also had the involvement of outside powers, such as Russia and the United States. Russia, an ally of the Syrian government, has provided the military support and conducted airstrikes in Syria since 2015. Russia's involvement in the conflict has been a major factor in the Syrian government's ability to hold on to power and push back against the opposition groups. The United States and other Western powers, on the other hand, have supported the opposition groups, providing arms and training the various factions within the Free Syrian Army. The United States has also conducted its own airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria. The involvement of these outside powers has complicated the conflict and made it even more difficult to find a resolution. The United States and Russia have often been at odds over the conflict, with the United States calling for the removal of President Bashar al-Assad and Russia supporting the Syrian government. The involvement of outside powers has also exacerbated the suffering of the Syrian people, as they have now become caught in the middle of a proxy war between two major global powers. The initial protests that sparked the conflict were driven by a desire for political change and an end to the government's oppressive policies. However, as the conflict has dragged on, it has become increasingly complex, with various factions and interests involved. Kurdish groups, religious minorities, and terrorist organizations have all become key players in the conflict. The involvement of outside powers has also added to the complexity, with each country pursuing its own interests and agendas. The ongoing violence and humanitarian crisis has had a devastating impact on the Syrian people and region. Millions of Syrians have been displaced, either fleeing the country or being internally displaced within Syria. The conflict has also had a destabilizing effect on the region, with the refugee crisis putting a strain on neighboring countries and the involvement of outside powers contributing to the regional tensions. Millions of Syrians have been displaced, either fleeing the country or being internally displaced within Syria. Many have fled to neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, seeking safety and shelter. The Syrian crisis has put strain on these countries as they struggle to accommodate the influx of displaced Syrians. The conflict has also had a destabilization effect on the region. The involvement of outside powers such as Russia and the United States has contributed to the regional tensions and further complicated the conflict. The presence of various extremist groups, including ISIS, has also contributed to the instability of the region. The humanitarian situation in Syria is dire, with many Syrians living in dire poverty and facing shortages of basic necessities such as food, water, and healthcare. The conflict has also had a devastating impact on Syria's infrastructure, with hospitals, schools, and homes being destroyed or damaged. The ongoing violence and humanitarian crisis in Syria has had a devastating impact on the Syrian people and the region as a whole. Journalists who do manage to report from within Syria often face significant risks, including the threat of violence from both the government and opposition groups. Many journalists have been abducted, imprisoned, or even killed while trying to report on the conflict.
Unfortunately, Gaddafi forces came right over the hill, and within seconds we were under heavy fire. The rest of the rebel vehicles retreated, and we were under heavy fire and immediately pinned down and had to surrender. I jumped up, tried to say we were journalists. Before I was captured, I saw our friend and colleague Anton Hamrel had been shot and was severely wounded. Then I was hit several times with a butt of AK-47, punched, and dragged into a vehicle with my hands tied behind my back.
You don't know what ultimately happened to Anton, correct?
We believe due to the
This is James
severity of his
Foley.
injuries, he passed away.
James Foley was an American journalist who was abducted in Syria in 2012 while covering the conflict. His disappearance received widespread attention, and his family and colleagues worked tirelessly to secure his release. Sadly, James Foley was brutally murdered by ISIS in 2014. His death was a tragic reminder of the dangers faced by journalists covering the Syrian conflict and the extreme violence and brutality of extremist groups such as ISIS. James Foley's death sent shockwaves through the journalism community and sparked outrage around the world. The death of James Foley and other journalists in Syria highlights the importance of ensuring the safety and protection of journalists covering the conflict. The international community must stand up for the rights of journalists and ensure that they are able to report on the conflict safely without the fear of retribution. As we conclude this episode on the origins of the Syrian conflict, we hope that we have provided a more thorough and in-depth understanding of the events that led to the current situation. The conflict began as a grassroots movement calling for political change and reform, but has since escalated into a complex, multifaceted war involving various factions and outside powers. The Syrian people have suffered greatly as a result of the conflict, with millions being displaced and the death toll reaching over 500,000. The impact of the conflict on the Syrian people in the region has been devastating, and the future remains uncertain. In the next episode, I'll delve deeper into the complexities of the Syrian conflict, exploring various factions and interests involved and the role of outside powers. I'll examine the involvement of Russia and the United States and how their support for different sides in the conflict has contributed to the ongoing violence and instability. I will also address the humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict and its impact on the region, including the refugee crisis and the strain on neighboring countries. I hope that through my exploration of the Syrian conflict, that I can shed light on the situation on the ground and bring attention to the suffering of the Syrian people. Thank you for listening. Join me next time as I continue my explanation of the Syrian conflict and the ongoing efforts to find a resolution to this devastating war.